wake up, and the air is wrong. Not cold in the way a morning is cold. Cold in the way a room feels when something has been burning and the fire went out hours ago. The walls are thin. The light that comes through the window is grey, flat, the kind of light that gives you no information about the day ahead. Your lungs pull in air that smells of damp wool, coal dust, and something else. Something older, animal, that you have stopped trying to identify. You sit up. Your back is stiff. The mattress beneath you is a sack filled with straw, and the straw compresses differently every night, so no two mornings begin with the same discomfort, only with discomfort. The child next to you is breathing. You check. You always check now. You do it before you open your eyes fully, before you decide what the day requires. You listen for the rise and fall of that small chest, and only when you hear it do you allow yourself to think about anything else. Outside, there is noise. Wheels on cobblestones. Someone coughing. A horse. Somewhere far away, a sound you can no longer locate with precision. A low, sustained rumble that might be thunder, might be industry, might be something you have learned not to think about directly. You know which direction that sound comes from. You do not look that way anymore. You get up. You do not stretch. You do not pause. The day does not have space for pausing. There is water to heat. There is bread if there is bread. There is a list of things that must happen before noon, or the afternoon will be impossible to recover. You have not thought about next year in a long time. You have stopped thinking even about next month. The unit of survival now is the day. Some days, it is the hour. Something is changing. You can feel it. Not in any single thing, but in the accumulation of small wrongnesses. The neighbor who coughed last week is not outside this morning. The market has fewer stalls. The priest said something at Sunday Mass that made the old women exchange looks. You do not know what is coming. You only know that the world is pulling tighter around you, and the space inside it is growing smaller. The year is 1918. The world is not ending. It has already been ending for 4 years. And most people do not know yet that the worst part has not arrived. To understand what living in 1918 requires of you, you need to understand the shape of the world you were born into. Not the world of generals and treaties and newspaper headlines. The world of the street, the kitchen, the factory floor, the hospital ward. That is the world that touches your body every day. You belong to a civilization that has organized itself around the premise that sacrifice is the price of order. Since August 1914, that sacrifice has been paid in flesh. Governments across Europe and beyond conscripted men from every class, every village, every trade. The war machine required bodies in numbers that had no historical precedent, and so bodies were taken. If you are a man of working age, you are either at the front, recently returned from the front, or waiting to go. There is no neutral position. Neutrality is itself a kind of declaration. If you are not at the front, you are sustaining the front. Factories that once made tools, furniture, and household goods now make shells, gas canisters, and wire. Women who never worked outside the home are working 12-hour shifts. Children who should be in school are in fields or in factories, filling roles that the conscripted men left behind. The economy of civilian life has been reorganized entirely around military production, and the goods that once made ordinary life bearable, food, fuel, medicine, clothing, are rationed, redirected, or simply no longer available. You do not own your labor. You are not asked if you consent to this reorganization. The state owns the emergency, and the emergency owns everything inside it. Dissent is not illegal in all places, but it is dangerous everywhere. Men who refuse conscription are imprisoned or shot. Women who speak against the war are surveilled. Newspapers are censored. The information you receive about the world has been filtered through governments that have a direct interest in maintaining your willingness to endure. This is the structure you were born into. not as theory, as the texture of every day you have lived since 1914. Now that you know who you are in this world, the question that follows is not philosophical. It is immediate. What does this world cost your body every single day? You work. That is the first fact of your life, and it comes before everything else. Before 1914, work in industrial Europe and North America was already brutal by any modern standard. Factory shifts ran 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours. Safety regulations were minimal, rarely enforced, and routinely ignored by employers who faced no meaningful legal consequence for killing a worker through negligence. The compensation for a worker's death was, in most places, a formal expression of regret, and nothing else. The war made this worse in ways that were mathematically predictable and morally invisible. With so many working-age men conscripted, the remaining labor force, women, the elderly, the very young, was asked to fill the gap without reducing production quotas. Output targets set for peacetime male workers were applied to female workers who had never operated the machines, who received no training, who were paid a fraction of the wage, and who were expected to perform at the same rate, or be replaced. In munitions factories, women worked with TNT and other explosive compounds that turned their skin yellow, damaged their livers, caused their hair to fall out, and, in enough documented cases, killed them. They were called canary girls, a term that combined observation and indifference. The color was caused by toxic absorption through skin and lungs. Workers who noticed their skin changing were told the color was temporary. Some of them died before it faded. In textile mills, in shipyards, in agricultural fields stripped of draft animals sent to the front, the body absorbed a daily toll that had no recovery period. Wages were controlled. Working hours were extended under emergency legislation. The right to strike was suspended in most belligerent nations. You could not negotiate. You could not leave. You could endure or be replaced by someone more desperate than you. And beneath all of this, the war was eating the food. Bread. That is where it begins to fall apart. In 1918, feeding yourself requires navigating a system that was never designed to handle what the war has done to it. Agricultural production across Europe has collapsed, not because the land stopped working, because the men who worked the land were taken. Horses were requisitioned for military transport. Chemical fertilizers were redirected to explosives production. The same compounds that made wheat grow were being used to make shells. Fields that had produced grain for generations sat partially unharvested, or were worked by women and older men who could not bring in the same volume. Germany and Austria-Hungary entered what their own governments called the turnip winter in late 1916 and into 1917. Civilian food intake dropped to levels that produced visible starvation in urban populations. By 1918, a German civilian was receiving roughly 1,000 calories a day through official rations, less than half what the body requires for moderate activity. Children showed signs of rickets and stunted growth that medical records documented in clinical detail. Adults developed edema, their bodies swelling with retained fluid as protein intake collapsed. Britain and France avoided mass starvation through naval supply lines and colonial extraction. But food insecurity was a constant pressure. Queues outside shops stretched around blocks in London. Rationing was introduced. Substitutes appeared: bread made with potato flour, margarine where butter had been, surrogate coffee, artificial sweeteners. You ate what was available, not what was nutritious. And the gap between those two things cost your body something it could not fully recover. In rural areas, the problem inverted. Food was sometimes produced, but could not reach cities. Transport networks were overwhelmed by military logistics. A farmer might have grain, and a city 10 miles away might have none. And the administrative machinery required to connect them had been repurposed for moving artillery. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as designed, for war. For you, it was slowly thinning the margin between having enough and not having enough at all. And then the margin disappeared for reasons that had nothing to do with food. In the spring of 1918, something begins moving through military camps in the United States, France, and Britain. It moves fast. Men who are healthy in the morning are feverish by afternoon and dead by the following day. The symptoms are not subtle. High fever, headache, muscle pain so severe that men describe it as their bones breaking from the inside. And then, in the worst cases, a cyanosis, a blue-gray discoloration of the skin as the lungs fill with fluid and oxygen transfer fails. Men who are cyanotic almost never recover. Military censors suppress the reports. A pandemic spreading through troop concentrations is a strategic liability. Spain, neutral in the war and without press censorship, reports the outbreak openly. And so the disease receives a name that has nothing to do with its origin: the Spanish flu. The name is a consequence of the same information suppression that will guarantee the pandemic spreads further and kills more people than it otherwise would have. You do not hear accurate reports. You hear rumors. You hear that people are getting sick, that they recover, that most of them recover, that it is like a bad influenza, and that you should stay inside if you can and wash your hands. The medical advice is not wrong, but it is also not sufficient, because the mechanism of the disease is not understood. Viruses are not yet identified as a category. The germ theory of disease is understood in broad strokes, but the tools to act on that understanding, antivirals, antibiotics to treat secondary bacterial pneumonia, oxygen therapy at scale, do not exist. What does exist is aspirin, recently made widely available and not yet known to be dangerous in the doses being prescribed. Physicians give patients aspirin for the fever. At high doses, aspirin causes pulmonary edema. The lungs fill with fluid. The treatment, in many cases, accelerates the death it was meant to prevent. This is not incompetence. This is the edge of knowledge. Every physician making that recommendation believes they are helping. The outcome is catastrophic, regardless. By autumn 1918, the second wave arrives. It is worse. Documented records show that in some cities, bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. In Philadelphia, horse-drawn carts collected corpses from streets and homes. In Cape Town, in Bombay, in Rio de Janeiro, in Samoa, the disease moved through populations that had no immunity, no medical infrastructure, and no warning. Between 50 and 100 million people will die. The uncertainty in that estimate is itself a measure of the chaos. There is something about 1918 that no one discusses in the standard accounts of the flu, the war, the collapse. Something that happened in the gap between military necessity and civilian suffering that required a specific and deliberate decision. In the final months of the war, as the second wave of the pandemic was accelerating, military commanders on multiple fronts continued moving troops. Troop transports that military medical officers knew to contain infected soldiers continued sailing. The logic was operational. The war had not yet ended, and the movement of forces was considered strategically necessary. The decision to halt troop movements to prevent disease spread was not made, could not be made. The machinery of war did not have a mechanism for pausing itself because of a health emergency. This meant that the same ships, the same rail lines, the same troop concentrations that spread the pandemic's first wave in spring were used again in autumn. Medical officers filed reports. Some were explicit. Moving these men will spread the disease. The reports were received, acknowledged, and overruled. Not by monsters. By administrators running a system that had no category for what was happening. The war had consumed the institutional capacity to respond to anything other than the war. The result was that a decision that might have been framed as protecting soldiers was, in practice, a decision to use the global military transport network as a vector for a lethal pandemic. The disease reached places it might never have reached without that infrastructure. Remote islands, interior populations, communities that had no contact with the outside world until a supply ship arrived. When it arrived, it brought the flu with it. In some Alaskan and Pacific communities, mortality rates exceeded 50% of the entire population. You do not know this. No one tells you. The governments managing the information have decided that knowing would not help you and might destabilize the home front morale they have spent 4 years constructing. So you receive the epidemic the way you receive the war, as something happening to you from outside, for reasons you are not fully permitted to understand. The law is supposed to be the thing that holds when everything else fails. In 1918, you discover that the law has already decided what it values, and that what it values is not you. Emergency legislation passed at the start of the war in most belligerent nations granted governments powers that had no peacetime precedent. Censorship of the press, suspension of habeas corpus in some jurisdictions, requisition of property without compensation. The right to conscript labor as well as soldiers. These laws were presented as temporary measures necessary for the duration of the emergency. By 1918, they have been in place for 4 years, and the bureaucracies that administer them have grown, entrenched, and developed institutional interests in their own continuation. When the pandemic arrives, these same emergency powers are applied. Governments decide what the public is told about the disease. Authorities in some cities close public gatherings, theaters, churches, schools, but the closures are inconsistent, motivated as much by economic and political considerations as by epidemiological ones. In cities where war production could not be halted, factories stayed open. Workers continued showing up because they could not afford not to. The law protected production. It did not protect the workers. Compensation for workers who became ill and could not work ranged from inadequate to non-existent. No sick leave. No death benefit that a family could live on. A worker who died of influenza in a munitions factory in Birmingham or Pittsburgh left a family that immediately faced eviction, hunger, and the termination of the only income that had been keeping them functional. The law did not create this situation, but it permitted it. And in permitting it, it made the pandemic significantly more lethal for the poor than for anyone else. If you are poor in 1918, you cannot quarantine. Your home is too small, too shared, too close to others in conditions that guarantee transmission. You cannot miss work. You cannot access a private physician. You present yourself to a public hospital that is already overwhelmed by war casualties, and you wait. And you hope that waiting does not cost you what it has already cost the person beside you. Women in 1918 are navigating a violence that is so structural it barely registers as such. The war pulled men out of domestic economies and replaced them with absence. Women who had never managed finances now managed finances, often with no access to credit, no legal standing to sign contracts in many jurisdictions, and no institutional support. Widows of soldiers received pensions that were calculated at rates set by men who assumed a woman's survival cost less than a man's. They were not enough. They were never enough. In factories, women worked under supervisors who had authority over their wages, their hours, their physical movement within the workplace, and in documented cases, their bodies. Sexual coercion in wartime industrial settings was widespread, rarely prosecuted, and almost never named in official records. The records that survive tend to be in the spaces between formal documentation, in the testimonies of labor organizers, in the correspondence of women writing to social welfare agencies, in hospital intake records that describe injuries with clinical precision and no context. Pregnancy in 1918 added a specific dimension of danger. Influenza during pregnancy killed both mother and child at dramatically elevated rates. Women who contracted the flu in the third trimester faced near certain loss of the child and significant risk of their own death. Obstetric care was minimal. Hospital beds for laboring women who were also febrile were not available in the quantities needed. Women gave birth at home, attended by whoever was present, in conditions that had not changed substantially from a century before. Grief was added to grief. Women who had already lost husbands to the war were now burying children. The support structures that might have absorbed this, extended family, community, religious institutions, were themselves depleted, frightened, and managing their own dead. First, the men went, then the money, then the food thinned, then the hospitals filled. By autumn 1918, the cascade is visible to anyone paying attention, which is everyone, because everyone is inside it. The war has been consuming institutional capacity for 4 years. Every system that existed to absorb civilian suffering, hospitals, charities, municipal relief agencies, religious organizations, extended family networks, has been operating above capacity since 1914. There is no reserve. There is nothing left to redirect. When the pandemic's second wave arrives in September and October, it finds a civilization with empty hands. Hospitals designed for 200 patients have 400. Nurses who have been working since 1914 without adequate rest are themselves collapsing. Medical supply chains are controlled by military logistics and cannot rapidly pivot to civilian pandemic response. The institutions that exist to coordinate public health, the nascent national health agencies of the early 20th century, have no authority to compel action, no precedent for this scale, and no tools that match the problem. Churches, which had served as centers of community support and meaning-making, faced a specific and devastating contradiction. Governments in some cities ordered the closure of public gatherings, but for many communities, the church was the only social institution that connected people across the fragmentation of wartime. Closing the church meant closing the last place where collective grief could be processed. Some congregations continued meeting, some of them died together. Families made decisions in the dark. A parent with influenza symptoms faced an impossible calculation: stay close to the children who needed care and expose them to the disease, or isolate and leave them without care in conditions where care was essential. There was no right answer. There was only the decision you made in the moment with the information you had, and then the outcome, which arrived regardless of whether your reasoning had been sound. The dominoes did not fall in a line. They fell in every direction at once, and yet people kept going. Not because they were heroic, because stopping was not available as an option. The mechanics of daily survival in 1918 required constant forward motion. Bread had to be found, water had to be heated, children had to be fed, and the only person available to do these things was you. Grief did not create a pause. It happened inside the same hours that everything else happened inside. Communities developed adaptive behaviors that were not organized, not planned, and not celebrated. They emerged because the alternative was dissolution. Neighbors left food outside the doors of quarantined households. Women covered the shifts of colleagues who were sick, not because they were required to, but because they understood, without needing to discuss it, that the reciprocal favor would eventually be needed. Children took on tasks that children should not have been performing, and they did so without complaint, because complaint required a frame of reference in which things had been different, and many of them were too young to remember when things had been different. In some communities, mutual aid societies formed under the pressure of the crisis. Informal networks of food sharing, childcare, and labor exchange that created a layer of resilience beneath the failing official structures. These networks were not recorded in government documents. They left traces in personal letters, in diary entries, in the oral histories gathered decades later by researchers who understood that the official record was not the whole record. Resilience here was not a choice or a virtue. It was a metabolic necessity. You adapted because adaptation was the only available response to a world that was not going to adapt for you. When we look at 1918 from the distance of a century, the tendency is to treat it as an accumulation of extraordinary events. The war, the pandemic, the collapse of empires. A perfect storm. A convergence of misfortunes that no one could have anticipated or prevented. That reading is wrong, and it matters that it is wrong. What happened in 1918 was not a coincidence. It was the logical outcome of systems that had been running at maximum capacity for 4 years, built on assumptions that could not survive sustained pressure. The war did not create the fragility of the food supply system. It revealed it. The pandemic did not create the inadequacy of public health infrastructure. It exposed it. The collapse of civilian welfare did not happen because the people in charge were negligent. It happened because the institutions they operated had never been designed to protect ordinary people under stress. They were designed to maintain order. Those are different things. The people who lived through 1918 were not fundamentally different from people living now. They were not tougher, more stoic, or more accepting of hardship. They were people operating inside a system that left them no option but to endure. And they endured because the alternative was immediate. The suffering of 1918 was not a natural disaster absorbed by resilient communities. It was a structural failure absorbed by people who had no choice in the matter. When you imagine 1918, do not imagine heroism. Imagine a Tuesday in October, grey light, the smell of something wrong, a child breathing, the sound, distant, of a world that does not know how to stop. Before you close this video, one question worth sitting with. If you had been alive in October 1918 in a working-class neighborhood in any major city in the world, with the resources available to a person of ordinary means at that time, what would you have done differently to survive? Put your answer in the comments. There is no correct response, only honest ones. If you want to keep going into the depths of history's most brutal moments, subscribe. The next period we are going to reconstruct may be even harder to look at directly,